she looked too ordinary for first class, and that was exactly why they decided to humiliate her. The golden lights of Terminal B reflected across the polished marble floors as passengers in tailored suits rolled expensive luggage toward Gate 14, their voices blending into the soft jazz floating through the airport lounge. Claire Whitmore walked quietly through the crowd wearing a simple beige sweater, dark jeans, and white sneakers that had clearly seen better days. Her hair rested loosely on her shoulders, untouched by the polished perfection surrounding her. In a place filled with designer handbags and luxury watches, she looked invisible. And people often mistook invisibility for weakness. A flight attendant standing near the boarding lane glanced at Claire's boarding pass before her smile slowly disappeared. Vanessa Cole had spent 12 years working first-class cabins for elite travelers, and she believed she could identify wealth within seconds. Expensive perfume. Diamond earrings. Italian shoes. Entitlement. Claire had none of those things. Vanessa's eyes narrowed slightly as she scanned the ticket again. She said, her voice suddenly colder, "I think you may be in the wrong boarding group." Claire offered a small polite smile. "No, I don't think so." Vanessa looked her up and down one more time, lingering on the worn canvas strap of Claire's carry-on bag. Behind them, several first-class passengers shifted impatiently. A businessman holding a silver laptop glanced over Claire's shoulder with visible annoyance. Another woman wearing oversized sunglasses whispered something to her husband, and both of them smirked quietly. Claire remained calm. "Seat 2A, she said softly. "That's my seat." Vanessa let out a short laugh that didn't sound kind. "First class is reserved for premium guests." The words landed harder than they should have. Not because they were loud, but because they were designed to embarrass quietly. The kind of humiliation meant to make someone leave on their own before others noticed. But people had already noticed. The line behind Claire slowed to a halt as nearby passengers pretended not to stare. A little boy standing beside his mother looked up at Claire with confused eyes while the adults around him exchanged subtle expressions of judgment. Claire tightened her fingers gently around her boarding pass. She could feel every pair of eyes on her now. Vanessa stepped slightly closer and lowered her voice, though not enough to avoid attention. "Coach boarding begins in about 20 minutes. You'll want to head down to the lower waiting area." Claire blinked once. "I'm not flying coach." Vanessa's professional smile disappeared completely. "Please don't make this difficult." Somewhere beyond the giant glass windows, rain tapped softly against the runway lights outside, but inside the terminal, the air had gone still. Claire looked down briefly at the boarding pass in her hand before meeting Vanessa's eyes again. Calm. Steady. Almost strangely steady. That calmness irritated Vanessa more than anger would have. Because people who truly didn't belong usually panicked by now. "I paid for this seat," Claire said quietly. "Then perhaps someone made a mistake," Vanessa replied. A hush slowly fell over the boarding lane. Even the businessman with the laptop stopped pretending not to listen. Claire stood there beneath the warm airport lights, surrounded by luxury travelers who had already decided who she was worth being. And none of them realized that somewhere 30,000 feet above the Atlantic Ocean, a private company jet carrying Ethan Whitmore was already changing course toward Chicago. Vanessa crossed her arms slowly, the polished gold pin on her navy uniform catching the terminal lights as if authority itself had been stitched into the fabric. She said louder this time, making sure nearby passengers could hear, "I am asking you one final time to step away from the first-class boarding lane." The businessman with the silver laptop let out a quiet chuckle under his breath. Another passenger shook his head impatiently as though Claire were personally delaying the flight. The pressure in the air shifted. What had started as quiet judgment was becoming a public spectacle. Claire looked around the terminal briefly. The giant digital screens reflected across the marble floors while boarding announcements echoed softly overhead. Somewhere nearby, espresso machines hissed behind the airport lounge bar. Life continued normally for everyone else. But for Claire, every second now felt painfully exposed. "I have a valid boarding pass," she said gently. "Then perhaps you should show it to someone in economy," Vanessa replied. A few passengers laughed quietly. Not loudly enough to seem cruel. Just enough to wound. Claire lowered her eyes for a moment, absorbing the humiliation without reacting. That calm restraint only irritated Vanessa further. She was used to confrontations ending quickly. Most people either apologized or became emotional. Claire did neither. And people who remained calm under pressure often carried secrets others could not yet see. Vanessa stepped aside dramatically and gestured toward the crowded seating area farther down the terminal. Coach passengers wait down there. Her voice dripped with polished condescension. This area is reserved. The businessman finally spoke aloud. Come on, he muttered. Some people really do not know their place. Claire heard him. Everyone did. A hush spread through the boarding lane as passengers pretended not to enjoy the moment. Even the little boy from earlier looked uncomfortable now, tugging lightly on his mother's sleeve. Claire swallowed slowly and tightened her grip on the handle of her carry-on suitcase. She could have ended this entire situation with a single phone call. But she had spent years watching how people treated strangers when they believed nobody important was watching. And moments like this always revealed more than wealth ever could. Vanessa glanced toward another employee standing near the scanner station. Get Richard, she said coldly. Now. Minutes later, Richard Hale arrived with quick, irritated steps, adjusting the cuffs of his expensive grey suit as he approached. His airport operations badge swung against his jacket while his sharp eyes immediately landed on Claire. He assessed her within seconds. Simple clothes. No designer labels. No visible status. Decision made. What seems to be the issue? He asked. Vanessa gave an exaggerated sigh. This. Passenger insists she belongs in first class. Richard extended his hand toward Claire without introducing himself. Boarding pass. Claire handed it over quietly. Richard scanned it once, then again. His expression flickered almost invisibly when he realized the ticket was genuine. Seat 2A. Fully paid. First class. But instead of apologizing, his jaw tightened. Because admitting fault in front of wealthy passengers would embarrass the airline staff more than humiliating one quiet woman. Identification, he said flatly. Claire blinked softly. Why? Additional verification. Do you ask every first-class passenger for identification? Richard's face hardened instantly. Nearby conversation stopped completely now. Even the airport lounge bartender paused mid-pour to glance toward the gate. Richard stepped closer, lowering his voice into something colder. Either cooperate with airport staff or we can involve security and remove you from the boarding area entirely. Claire looked at him for several silent seconds. Then slowly, she reached into her purse. But instead of pulling out identification, she unlocked her phone and typed a single message. Maybe you should know what is happening on your airplane. Thousands of feet above the Midwest, inside a private jet wrapped in midnight black paint, Ethan Whitmore read the message once. Then his expression disappeared completely. Inside the private jet cruising above layers of silver clouds, silence settled heavily across the cabin after Ethan Whitmore finished reading the message on his phone. The two executives seated across from him immediately noticed the change in his expression. Ethan was known throughout the business world for his calm demeanor, the kind of man who never raised his voice because he never needed to. But now his eyes had gone completely still. Dangerous still. He looked out the oval window briefly as fading sunlight painted the clouds in shades of gold and blue. Then he pressed a single button beside his seat. Change our route, he said quietly. The flight attendant blinked. So? We are landing in Chicago. No further explanation came. None was needed. Back inside Terminal B, Claire stood beneath the bright boarding lights while Richard examined her identification with exaggerated suspicion. Vanessa remained beside him with folded arms and the satisfied posture of someone convinced she had already won. Nearby passengers watched openly now. Some with pity. Others with amusement. The little boy who had been staring earlier whispered something to his mother again, but this time the woman gently pulled him closer, clearly embarrassed by the scene unfolding in front of them. Claire could feel the weight of every eye in the terminal, but her face remained composed. She had spent most of her life learning that dignity was not something others gave you. It was something you protected quietly, even when people tried to strip it away. Richard handed her identification back without apology. You still cannot board until we complete additional verification. Claire looked at him calmly. Additional verification for what exactly? Richard adjusted his tie. Your profile does not match standard first-class travel patterns. The words hung in the air for a moment before several passengers exchanged awkward glances. Even the businessman with the silver laptop looked uncomfortable now. Because everyone understood what Richard truly meant. Claire lowered her eyes briefly, almost saddened rather than offended. You mean I do not look wealthy enough? Richard's jaw tightened. I did not say that. You did not have to. The terminal grew painfully quiet. Vanessa quickly stepped forward, trying to regain control of the moment. This is not personal. First class is an exclusive environment. We simply have standards to maintain. Claire almost smiled at the irony of the word standards. Years ago, before Ethan built Whitmore Aviation into one of the largest luxury airline companies in America, Claire had worked double shifts at a bookstore in Milwaukee just to afford rent. She still remembered customers ignoring her because of her simple clothes. She remembered wealthy shoppers speaking slowly to her as though kindness only belonged to rich people. Money had changed her life, but it had never changed the way she saw people. That was why she still dressed simply. Why she still avoided designer labels and private entrances. Ethan used to tease her about it gently. You are probably the only billionaire's wife who shops with coupons, he once joked during breakfast. Claire had laughed and replied, that is because I remember what it feels like when nobody sees you. Now, standing in the middle of the crowded terminal, she realized these people did not see her either. To them, she was just another woman who did not belong near luxury. Richard motioned toward the side waiting area. Please step away from the boarding lane while we resolve this. The phrasing sounded polite, but the humiliation underneath it was sharp enough to cut glass. Claire slowly lifted her carry-on bag and walked toward the seating area as dozens of passengers watched her. The businessman lowered his eyes as she passed. A young flight attendant near the gate looked visibly uncomfortable, as though she wanted to apologize but lacked the courage. Vanessa, meanwhile, exhaled in relief. She believed the problem had finally been handled. She had no idea that at that exact moment, 3 black SUVs were already speeding toward the airport through downtown Chicago traffic while one of the most powerful men in the airline industry sat in complete silence inside the lead vehicle. Claire sat quietly near the far end of the terminal beside a tall window streaked with rain while the first-class passengers continued boarding behind her. The leather chair beneath her creaked softly as she placed her carry-on suitcase beside her feet and folded her hands in her lap. Around her, airport life moved forward with indifferent rhythm. Rolling suitcases clicked across marble floors. Boarding announcements echoed overhead in calm professional voices. Somewhere nearby, a coffee grinder hummed behind the lounge counter. But beneath the ordinary sounds of the terminal, tension still lingered heavily in the air. Several passengers glanced toward Claire before quickly looking away again, as though embarrassed by what they had witnessed yet unwilling to acknowledge it openly. Humiliation in public spaces always worked like that. Most people preferred silence over courage. Near the gate entrance, Vanessa adjusted the cuffs of her navy blazer with visible satisfaction while Richard reviewed boarding documents on his tablet. To them, the situation had been resolved. The woman who did not belong had been removed from sight. Vanessa leaned closer to Richard and lowered her voice. I told you something felt off the second she walked up. Richard gave a small nod without looking up. People try things like this all the time. Honestly, Vanessa continued, glancing toward Claire, wealthy passengers expect a certain atmosphere. Imagine spending $10,000 on a seat just to sit next to someone who looks like she wandered in from a bus station. Richard smirked faintly. You handled it correctly. What neither of them noticed was the young flight attendant standing nearby who had overheard every word. Her name tag read Emily Parker, and unlike Vanessa, she had grown up in a small town where her mother worked 2 jobs cleaning motel rooms just to keep the lights on. Emily looked toward Claire with quiet discomfort. There was something deeply wrong about the entire situation, and she could feel it settling heavily in her chest. After a long moment, Emily walked slowly toward the seating area carrying a small bottled water from the lounge counter. Claire looked up as the young attendant approached nervously. Emily said softly, offering the bottle with both hands, "I just wanted to say I am sorry for the delay." Claire accepted it with a gentle smile. "Thank you." Emily hesitated. "I saw your ticket earlier. You really do belong in first class." Claire almost laughed at the phrasing. Belong. Such a strange word. Apparently not everyone agrees, she replied quietly. Emily glanced back toward the gate where Vanessa stood laughing softly with another employee. Some people care too much about appearances. Claire studied the young attendant carefully for a moment before answering. And some people lose themselves trying to impress strangers. Emily lowered her eyes slightly, absorbing the words. Then her radio suddenly crackled sharply against her uniform. "All gate personnel report immediately. Flight delay update incoming." Emily excused herself quickly and hurried back toward the boarding lane. Within seconds, confusion began spreading across the terminal. Passengers pulled phones from pockets. Business travelers checked expensive watches impatiently. The giant digital board above the gate flickered once before the status beside Flight 247 changed from ON time to temporary hold. Groans spread through the waiting area immediately. Vanessa frowned. "What now?" Richard grabbed his radio. "Operations, this is Gate 14. Explain the delay." Static crackled briefly before a tense voice responded. "Corporate authorization hold. Nobody boards until further notice." Richard straightened slowly. "Corporate." Nearby passengers exchanged confused murmurs. Even the businessman with the silver laptop looked irritated now. "I have a connecting flight in London," he snapped loudly. "What is going on?" No one answered him. Because at that exact moment, black SUVs were pulling beneath the private executive entrance on the far side of the airport while security personnel suddenly began moving through the terminal with nervous urgency. And somewhere deep inside the operations center, senior airline executives were receiving a message that made the color drain from their faces. Ethan Whitmore was coming. The atmosphere inside Terminal B changed slowly at first, almost invisibly, like the pressure shift before a storm. Airline employees who had been casually chatting moments earlier suddenly moved with rigid urgency. Security personnel appeared near the executive corridors. Managers who normally stayed hidden in private offices stepped onto the terminal floor with tense expressions and hurried footsteps. Passengers immediately noticed. Wealthy travelers were used to delays. They were not used to panic. Richard lowered his radio slowly after hearing another burst of static from operations control. The color had faded slightly from his face now. Vanessa noticed it instantly. "What is happening?" she whispered. Richard glanced around before lowering his voice. "Corporate intervention." Vanessa frowned. "Over one delayed flight." Before Richard could answer, another supervisor rushed toward them holding a tablet tightly against his chest. "We need the gate cleared immediately," the man said under his breath. "Senior executives are on the way." Richard blinked. "Executives. Not just executives." The man swallowed hard. "Whitmore executive team." The words hit Richard like ice water. Vanessa's confident posture shifted almost imperceptibly. Every employee inside Whitmore Aviation knew that name. Ethan Whitmore was not simply wealthy. He was the airline. He had built the company from a struggling regional carrier into one of the most powerful luxury aviation brands in the country. Employees spoke about him the way soldiers spoke about decorated generals. Calm. Brilliant. Demanding. and almost impossible to impress. Vanessa forced out a nervous laugh. Why would corporate care about Gate 14? The supervisor stared at her for a second too long before answering carefully. Apparently someone important filed a complaint. A silence followed that sentence. Not loud silence. Dangerous silence. Nearby, Claire remained seated quietly beside the rain-streaked windows, unaware that several employees had already begun glancing nervously in her direction. Emily approached her again carefully. She said softly, "Would you like anything while we wait?" Claire smiled politely. "I am fine, thank you." Emily hesitated before sitting briefly in the empty chair beside her. "Can I ask you something?" Claire looked at her gently. "Of course." Emily lowered her voice. "Why did you not tell them who you are?" Claire turned slightly toward the giant windows overlooking the glowing runway lights outside. Planes moved slowly through the rain like shadows crossing glass. Because people reveal themselves most honestly when they think you have nothing to offer them. Emily absorbed the words quietly. Across the terminal, Vanessa watched the interaction with growing irritation. Something about Claire's calmness now unsettled her deeply. Most humiliated passengers became angry, emotional, defensive. Claire looked almost sad for them instead. Suddenly, a sharp voice echoed from the terminal entrance. "Move aside, please." Heads turned instantly. A line of airport security officers was clearing a path through the crowded concourse while several senior executives in dark tailored suits hurried behind them. Their polished shoes struck sharply against the marble floors as nervous employees stepped aside. Richard's heartbeat visibly quickened. He recognized two of the executives immediately from internal corporate conferences. Men who normally operated 3 floors above ordinary staff access. They never came to gates personally. Never. One of them approached Richard directly. "Who is in charge here?" Richard straightened instantly. "I am." The executive's eyes hardened. "Then you better explain why the chairman personally ordered this aircraft grounded." Richard froze. Beside him, Vanessa's face slowly lost color. "Chairman. Not chief executive officer. Chairman." There was only one person in the company employees referred to that way. And somewhere near the private terminal entrance beyond the secured corridors, a black SUV door had just opened beneath the cold Chicago rain while Ethan Whitmore stepped onto the pavement wearing a charcoal overcoat and an expression so calm it terrified everyone around him. Rainwater shimmered beneath the terminal lights as the convoy of black SUVs rolled silently across the private executive entrance reserved for corporate leadership. Security personnel straightened instantly. Airport managers who moments earlier had been issuing orders now stood frozen beside the glass doors with nervous expressions and tightened jaws. Then the rear passenger door opened. Ethan Whitmore stepped out slowly, buttoning the front of his charcoal overcoat against the cold Chicago rain. At 46, Ethan carried the kind of presence that money alone could never buy. Calm authority. The dangerous stillness of a man accustomed to being obeyed without raising his voice. One executive hurried beside him carrying a tablet filled with rapidly updating reports. "Sir, we are still gathering details." Ethan continued walking without slowing. "I already have the details." His voice was quiet enough that nobody nearby dared interrupt him again. Inside Terminal B, tension spread like electricity through the gate area. Employees whispered into radios. Supervisors checked their phones repeatedly. Even the passengers sensed something larger than an ordinary delay was unfolding now. Claire remained seated beside the windows, watching raindrops slide slowly across the glass while the runway lights blurred softly beyond them. She heard the sudden shift in noise before she saw anything. Conversations fading. Footsteps stopping. The subtle silence that arrives whenever powerful people enter a room. Emily noticed it too. Her eyes widened toward the terminal entrance. "Oh my God," she whispered. Claire slowly turned her head. Ethan Whitmore walked through the terminal surrounded by executives and security personnel, yet somehow the crowd seemed to part for him naturally before anyone even asked them to move. The businessman with the silver laptop instantly stood straighter. Several employees lowered their eyes the moment he passed. Vanessa felt her stomach tighten painfully as recognition crashed into her all at once. She had seen him before only through company broadcasts and leadership conferences projected onto giant ballroom screens. But seeing him in person felt entirely different. More intimidating. More real. Richard swallowed hard and quickly adjusted his tie again as Ethan approached the gate area with measured steps. Every polished shoe striking the marble floor echoed through the terminal like a countdown. Mr. Whitmore, one senior executive said nervously, "We deeply apologize for the disruption." Ethan did not answer him. His attention had already moved past the gate. Past the employees. Past the executives. Directly toward Claire. The entire terminal seemed to hold its breath. Vanessa suddenly realized something horrifying. Ethan was not looking around trying to identify the passenger involved. He already knew exactly where she was. Claire slowly stood from her seat, still holding the unopened bottle of water Emily had given her earlier. For a brief moment, neither she nor Ethan spoke. Then Ethan crossed the final few feet between them and gently took her carry-on bag from beside her chair as though nothing else in the terminal existed. "I am sorry I was late," he said softly. Claire gave him a small tired smile. "You were in New York." Ethan's eyes moved briefly across her face, searching quietly for signs of hurt she was trying not to show. "Did they embarrass you?" The question landed heavily in the silence around them. Nobody moved. Nobody breathed. Claire hesitated before answering carefully. "I think they embarrassed themselves." A faint sadness crossed Ethan's expression. Then he bent slightly and picked up the scarf that had slipped unnoticed from Claire's chair onto the polished floor beside her feet. The gesture was simple. Gentle. Intimate. But it shattered the final illusion inside the terminal. Vanessa's face drained completely of color. Richard looked physically ill now. Around them, passengers exchanged stunned whispers as realization spread through the crowd like wildfire. The quiet woman they had watched being humiliated for the last hour was not merely connected to power. She was the wife of the man who owned the entire airline. And suddenly every cruel word spoken beneath the bright terminal lights felt impossible to take back. No one in Terminal B seemed to remember how to move anymore. The marble floors, the glowing departure screens, the quiet jazz drifting from the airport lounge, all of it faded beneath the crushing weight of realization spreading through the gate area. Vanessa stood completely frozen beside the boarding scanner, her perfectly rehearsed confidence shattered beyond repair. Richard looked as though the air had been pulled from his lungs. Around them, passengers who had watched Claire's humiliation only minutes earlier now avoided eye contact entirely. Ethan Whitmore draped Claire's scarf gently across her shoulders before finally turning toward the airline staff. His movements remained calm. Controlled. That calmness terrified them more than anger ever could. "Who delayed my wife from boarding?" he asked quietly. Nobody answered immediately. Richard stepped forward first, forcing himself to speak through a tightening throat. "Mr. Whitmore, I believe there has been a misunderstanding." Ethan looked at him without expression. A misunderstanding. Richard swallowed hard. "We were following security procedures." Ethan glanced briefly toward Claire. "Did my wife threaten anyone?" "No, sir." "Did she violate policy?" "No, sir." Ethan's eyes returned to Richard slowly. "Then explain the procedure." The silence that followed became unbearable. Vanessa could feel dozens of passengers watching her now the same way they had watched Claire earlier. Judgment had changed direction. Emily stood near the edge of the gate area holding her breath while senior executives exchanged nervous glances behind Ethan. Finally, Vanessa forced herself to step forward. "Sir, we were simply trying to maintain the integrity of the first-class environment." The moment the words left her mouth, she realized how terrible they sounded. Ethan tilted his head slightly. "Integrity." Vanessa's hands trembled faintly beneath her folded arms. Your wife's appearance raised concerns among staff and passengers. Claire lowered her eyes briefly. Not hurt anymore. Just disappointment. Ethan noticed it immediately. That subtle sadness in her face seemed to affect him more deeply than the humiliation itself. He looked around the terminal slowly, taking in the expensive luggage, tailored suits, polished marble floors, and silent crowd gathered around them. So the concern, he said calmly, was that she did not look wealthy enough to deserve respect. Nobody answered. Because nobody could deny it anymore. Ethan took a slow breath before speaking again. Do you know how Whitmore Aviation started? Vanessa blinked uncertainly. Richard remained silent. 23 years ago, Ethan continued, I worked baggage loading at a regional airport in Milwaukee. 12-hour shifts. $42,000 a year. The first suit I ever owned came from a thrift store. Several passengers exchanged stunned glances. Ethan rarely spoke publicly about his past. And my wife, he said softly, glancing toward Claire again, worked night shifts at a bookstore so her mother could afford cancer treatments. The terminal had gone completely silent now. Even the distant boarding announcement seemed smaller somehow. Ethan stepped closer toward Vanessa and Richard, though his voice never rose. People like you look at clothing and decide who deserves kindness. You see simplicity and assume weakness. You see humility and mistake it for insignificance. Vanessa's eyes filled with panic. Sir, I deeply apologize. We did not know who she was. Ethan's expression remained unreadable. That, he said quietly, is the entire problem. The word struck harder than shouting ever could. A businessman near the boarding lane slowly lowered his eyes in shame. The woman with oversized sunglasses looked visibly uncomfortable now, remembering the whispered comments she had made earlier. Claire watched the scene quietly, her hands folded gently in front of her while rain continued tapping softly against the giant windows overlooking the runway. She had seen this transformation before. Arrogance collapsing into fear the moment power entered the room. But true character revealed itself long before apologies began. Ethan turned toward one of the senior executives standing nearby. Pull the gate security footage, he said calmly. Every minute since my wife entered this terminal. Richard's face lost the last trace of color. Vanessa looked as though she might collapse. Because in that moment, they finally understood something terrifying. Ethan Whitmore had not come simply to defend his wife. He had come to see exactly who his employees became when they believed nobody important was watching. The rain outside intensified, streaking silver across the towering terminal windows while the giant departure board continued flashing temporary hold above Gate 14. Nobody complained anymore. The passengers who had once sighed impatiently now stood in complete silence, watching one of the most uncomfortable moments of accountability they had ever witnessed unfold beneath the bright airport lights. Ethan Whitmore remained calm at the center of it all, one hand resting lightly against Claire's carry-on bag while senior executives gathered nervously around him holding tablets and headsets. A middle-aged executive with silver hair stepped forward carefully. Sir, security footage from the terminal has been pulled. Ethan nodded once. Play it. Richard's stomach visibly tightened. Vanessa closed her eyes briefly as though preparing for impact. Nearby, several gate employees quietly stepped backward, instinctively distancing themselves from the disaster unfolding in front of them. Within seconds, one of the large monitor screens above the gate flickered alive. Grainy black and white security footage filled the display. The terminal from earlier. Claire approaching the boarding lane quietly with her carry-on bag. Vanessa checking the ticket. Then the humiliation began replaying in brutal clarity for everyone to see. No dramatic music. No editing. Just raw behavior stripped of excuses. The passengers watched themselves on screen whispering and smirking while Claire stood alone beneath the bright overhead lights. Richard demanding identification. Vanessa gesturing dismissively toward economy seating. Coach passengers wait down there. Hearing the words aloud now sounded uglier somehow. Smaller. Crueler. The businessman with the silver laptop slowly rubbed his forehead in visible shame. The woman with oversized sunglasses lowered her eyes entirely. Even strangers who had done nothing wrong looked uncomfortable simply witnessing it. Claire herself remained completely still throughout the playback. No anger. No triumph. Only quiet sadness. Ethan noticed. That sadness affected him more deeply than public embarrassment ever could. The footage continued. Richard threatening security involvement. Vanessa commenting about maintaining the integrity of first class. A few soft laughs from nearby passengers. Then finally Claire walking alone toward the waiting area carrying her suitcase while people stared. The screen went black. Nobody spoke afterward. The silence inside the terminal became so heavy that the distant rumble of thunder outside could suddenly be heard through the glass walls. Ethan looked slowly toward Vanessa first. How long have you worked for this airline? Vanessa swallowed hard. 12 years, sir. And in 12 years, Ethan asked quietly, did nobody ever teach you that dignity applies to every passenger? Tears formed instantly in Vanessa's eyes now. Sir, I made a terrible mistake. Ethan's expression remained unreadable. No. A mistake is accidental. The words landed softly, but they hit harder than shouting. Vanessa looked down immediately, unable to meet his eyes. Ethan then turned toward Richard. You saw a valid ticket? Yes, sir. You saw valid identification? Yes, sir. And you still treated my wife like she did not belong in this terminal. Richard's voice nearly disappeared. Yes, sir. Ethan took a slow breath before looking around the crowded gate area one final time. This airline was built for people who spent their whole lives being told they were not important enough, he said calmly. Teachers. Nurses. Soldiers. Families saving for one special trip. People who worked overtime just to experience something beautiful for a few hours. His eyes hardened slightly for the first time all evening. The moment employees begin deciding who deserves respect based on clothing, watches, or appearances, this company loses everything it was meant to stand for. Several executives lowered their eyes. Emily stood perfectly still beside the boarding scanner, visibly emotional now. Ethan glanced toward her briefly. What is your name? Emily Parker, sir. You were the only employee who treated my wife with kindness tonight. Emily looked stunned. I just brought her water. Ethan gave a faint nod. Exactly. The room fell silent again. Because everyone there suddenly understood something most people spend their entire lives missing. True character is revealed in the moments when kindness offers no reward at all. For several long seconds, nobody inside Terminal B moved at all. The storm outside continued washing rain across the giant airport windows while the runway lights shimmered against the wet pavement like blurred stars. The security footage screen above the gate had already gone dark, but the images remained painfully alive in everyone's minds. Vanessa stood silently with tears running down carefully applied makeup she no longer seemed aware of. Richard looked hollow now, stripped completely of authority beneath the bright terminal lights. The passengers who had once watched Claire with judgment now avoided looking at her entirely. Ethan Whitmore slowly turned toward the senior executives gathered beside him. Effective immediately, he said calmly, both employees are suspended pending full review by corporate ethics and customer relations. Neither Vanessa nor Richard argued. They understood there was nothing left to defend. Because the worst punishment had already happened. They had been forced to see themselves clearly. Ethan then looked toward the passengers near the boarding lane. This flight will depart once every passenger is reboarded with the respect they deserved from the beginning. His voice remained measured, but every word carried weight. A quiet murmur spread through the terminal as passengers shifted awkwardly, ashamed of how easily they had participated in someone else's humiliation simply by staying silent. The businessman with the silver laptop finally stepped forward toward Claire. He said quietly, unable to fully meet her eyes, I owe you an apology. Claire studied him gently for a moment before offering a small nod. Thank you." There was no bitterness in her voice. Somehow that made the guilt heavier for everyone listening. Nearby, the woman with oversized sunglasses approached next. "I should not have laughed earlier." Claire smiled faintly. Sometimes people follow crowds before they follow their conscience. The woman lowered her eyes immediately. One by one, the atmosphere inside the terminal changed. Not through fear of Ethan's power, but through the uncomfortable realization that every person there had been given a choice earlier that evening. And most of them had failed it. Emily quietly reopened the boarding lane while employees hurried to reorganize the delayed departure. But now the same passengers who once pushed impatiently ahead stepped aside respectfully as Claire approached the gate again. No whispers followed her this time. No smirks. Only silence. Ethan walked beside her carrying the same worn canvas bag Vanessa had judged so quickly earlier that night. As they reached the boarding scanner, Emily looked visibly emotional. "Mrs. Whitmore," she said softly, "I hope you still choose to fly with us again." Claire glanced toward Ethan briefly before answering. "That depends on whether this airline remembers what tonight was really about." Emily nodded slowly, understanding immediately. Not status. Not money. Humanity. Inside the first-class cabin, the atmosphere felt entirely different now. Passengers who earlier avoided eye contact quietly greeted Claire as she walked past. The businessman even stood from his seat to let her enter the row more comfortably. Ethan waited until Claire settled into seat 2A before gently placing her scarf beside her. "Are you all right?" he asked softly. Claire looked out the oval window where rainwater slid slowly beneath the glowing runway lights. "I am," she answered after a moment. "I just wish kindness did not require power before people offered it." Ethan sat beside her in silence for several seconds. Then the captain's voice finally echoed through the cabin announcing departure clearance for London. Around them, seatbelt lights illuminated softly overhead while the aircraft slowly pushed back from the gate. But before the engines fully roared to life, Ethan reached for Claire's hand quietly beneath the dim cabin lights. Outside the terminal windows, the storm clouds were already beginning to break apart. And somewhere behind them, under bright airport lights and polished marble floors, an entire terminal full of strangers had just been reminded that the true measure of class has never been money, appearance, or status. It has always been how you treat people when you believe they have nothing to offer you in return.